My sister clinked her crystal glass against my mother's wine glass. You are already 38 and still completely single. It must be so incredibly tough spending every single Christmas alone. The entire dining room erupted in loud, cruel laughter. My mother wiped a tear of amusement from her eye and raised her glass to toast the family failure. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I calmly set my water glass down on the pristine white tablecloth. I looked at the people who had spent my entire life making me feel small and I smiled. Do not worry about me, I said with absolute certainty. I have been married for a long time. My mother froze with her wine halfway to her mouth. The room dropped into a dead, suffocated silence. They thought I had lost my mind. They had no idea the man who was about to knock on the front door owned the very ground they were standing on. Before I tell you exactly whose knock shattered their perfect holiday illusion, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a toxic family dinner. Trust me, you will want to hear what happened when my husband finally stepped into the light. My name is Roxanne. I am 38 years old and for as long as I can remember I have been the designated disappointment in my family. We grew up in a beautiful affluent neighborhood in Atlanta. To the outside world, my parents Brenda and Calvin presented the perfect image of upper middle class success. They drove luxury cars. They attended the right church. They hosted the most elaborate neighborhood parties. But behind the heavy oak doors of our home, the atmosphere was suffocating. In my family, love was not something you were given freely. It was a currency you had to earn, and the exchange rate was always rigged against me. My younger sister, Monique, was 32 years old, and the undisputed golden child. From the moment she was born, she could do no wrong. She was the cheerleader, the homecoming queen, the daughter my mother could parade around like a shiny trophy. I was the quiet one, the one who preferred books to beauty pageants, the one who asked too many questions. By the time I reached adulthood, my mother had firmly cast me in the role of the tragic spinster sister. It was a narrative she maintained with ruthless dedication because it made her and Monique look better by comparison. Tonight was Christmas Eve. The dining room table was set with my mother's finest china and polished silver. The smell of roasted turkey and honey-baked ham filled the air, mixing with the expensive perfume my mother and sister wore. I sat at the far end of the table picking at my green beans. Across from me sat Monique and her husband Trevor. Trevor was 35 years old. He was a white man who worked as a middle manager at a corporate commercial real estate firm downtown. Trevor carried himself with the kind of unearned arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of privilege. He loved being the savior of our family dinners. He loved inserting himself into our conversations to offer unsolicited advice, acting as though his mere presence elevated our social standing. My parents adored him. They treated his every word like gospel, even when he was clearly talking down to them. My father Calvin sat at the head of the table quietly chewing his food. He was 62 years old, and had spent his entire marriage avoiding conflict by agreeing with whatever my mother said. If my mother declared the sky was green, my father would compliment the shade. He never protected me. He never stood up for me. He just kept his head down and let the women in his life dictate the terms of my misery. The conversation had started normally enough before it inevitably shifted to my perceived shortcomings. It always happened this way. They would discuss their achievements for 20 minutes and then turn their sights on me to highlight the contrast. Trevor leaned back in his expensive dining chair and swirled his bourbon. He looked at me with a patronizing smile that made my stomach turn. You know, Roxanne, my firm is actually going through a major transition right now. We were just acquired by Vanguard Holdings. It is a massive global conglomerate. Everyone at the office is terrified about restructuring, but management assured me my position is safe. In fact, they are looking to hire some new support staff. I kept my face perfectly neutral. That sounds interesting, Trevor. He chuckled condescendingly. I am bringing this up because I know you have been struggling. If you need it, my firm is hiring a front desk receptionist. It is an entry-level role and the pay is basically minimum wage, but I could probably put in a good word for you. It would get you out of that depressing little apartment of yours and give you some actual purpose. Plus, you would get to see how a real corporate environment operates. I took a slow sip of my water. Trevor thought I lived in a depressing little apartment. He thought I needed a minimum wage receptionist job to give my life purpose. He had absolutely no idea that I was the director of crisis management for the elite ultra-wealthy of Atlanta. More importantly, he had no idea that I secretly owned the PR firm I worked for. I made more money in a single afternoon handling a scandal for a politician than Trevor made in an entire year of pushing papers. But I never told my family about my success. I knew exactly what they would do if they found out I had money. They would demand it. They would claim they deserved it. That is very generous of you, Trevor, my mother. Brenda chimed in. Her voice dripped with fake sympathy. You really should take him up on that offer, Roxanne. Look at your sister. Monique is 32 and she has a beautiful home, a successful husband, and a vibrant social life. You are 38. You cannot just hide in your shell forever. You need to put yourself out there before it is too late. Not that there are many good men looking for a woman your age with no real career. My father nodded silently, keeping his eyes on his plate. Monique flipped her long hair over her shoulder and sighed dramatically. I just worry about you, Roxanne. It is honestly embarrassing when my friends ask what my older sister is doing with her life. I never know what to say. I tell them you are finding yourself, but it has been 2 decades. You are not a college kid backpacking through Europe. You are a middle-aged woman with nothing to show for it. I place my hands in my lap under the table, hiding the diamond tennis bracelet I had bought myself for my last birthday. I listened to them tear me down piece by piece. It was a well-rehearsed routine. They fed off each other, building a crescendo of insults disguised as familial concern. Mom, I do not need a receptionist job, I said calmly. I am doing perfectly fine. Fine is a relative term. My mother snapped. She placed her wine glass on the table with a sharp clink. You rent a tiny place. You drive a 5-year-old car. You show up to family dinners wearing clothes from a department store. We paid for your entire life growing up, and this is how you repay us? By being utterly mediocre. That was a lie. A blatant rewriting of history. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. You did not pay for my life growing up, Mom. I took out crippling student loans to pay for my own university tuition because you told me there was no money left. But 6 months later, you handed Monique $80,000 for a down payment on her house. Monique scoffed and rolled her eyes. Oh, here we go again. Always playing the victim. Always bringing up the past because you have no future. Mom and Dad invested in my house because they knew I was a safe investment. I was getting married to Trevor. We were building a family. You were just floundering around. Why would they throw away their hard-earned money on someone who was clearly never going to succeed? Trevor reached over and patted Monique on the hand, giving her a sickeningly sweet look of approval. Exactly, babe. It is just basic economics. You do not pour capital into a sinking ship. Roxanne, you have to look at this objectively. You bring no value to the table. No husband. No assets. No legacy. My mother raised her glass, her face flushed with the thrill of the attack. You are already 38 and still completely single. It must be so tough spending every single Christmas alone. Monique laughed loudly, a sharp grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. The entire dining room erupted in cruel laughter. Trevor chuckled, shaking his head. Even my father managed a weak, pathetic smile. My mother wiped a tear of amusement from her eye. She held her glass higher, looking around the room to ensure she had everyone's full attention. To Roxanne, she announced the family failure. May she eventually find a shred of dignity. They all raised their glasses. They drank to my supposed misery. They reveled in my fabricated isolation. For 38 years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had let them control the narrative. I had let them believe they were superior because it was easier than dealing with their greed. But tonight was different. Tonight, the game was ending. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I reached out and calmly set my water glass down on the pristine white tablecloth. The soft thud of the glass drew their attention back to me. I looked at the people who had spent my entire life making me feel small. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Do not worry about me, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority. I have been married for 5 years. The reaction was instantaneous. My mother froze with her wine halfway to her mouth. Monique choked on her drink, coughing and sputtering into her napkin. Trevor stared at me, his smug expression melting into total bewilderment. The room dropped into a dead, suffocated silence. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Monique caused her breath. Her face was red, her eyes wide with malicious disbelief. Married? You have been married for 5 years. She burst into hysterical laughter, slamming her hand against the table. Oh my God, she has completely lost her mind. She is actually hallucinating from loneliness. My mother set her glass down so hard the wine spilled over the rim, staining the white cloth. Roxanne, stop this nonsense immediately. It is bad enough that you are a failure. You do not need to humiliate us by making up pathetic lies. Married to who? A homeless man you met at the bus stop. Trevor crossed his arms, looking at me with deep pity. Roxanne, mental illness is nothing to be ashamed of. If you are experiencing delusions, we can get you help. I have a friend who is a psychiatrist, but making up a fake husband to save face at Christmas dinner is a new low even for you. I am not lying, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. We had a private ceremony in Paris 5 years ago. I kept it a secret because I knew exactly how you would react. I knew you would try to ruin it. I knew you would demand things from him. So, I protected my peace. My father finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. Roxanne, if you were really married, where is this man? Why have we never seen him? Why is he not here tonight? Monique leaned across the table, her eyes narrowing with vicious triumph. Yes, Roxanne, where is your imaginary husband? Did he get stuck in traffic riding his bicycle? Or maybe he is too busy working his shift at the fast food restaurant. Show us this amazing man you have been hiding. I dare you. My mother crossed her arms, a cruel smirk returning to her lips. She is lying, Calvin. Look at her. What kind of man would secretly marry a woman like her and stay hidden for 5 years? A coward or a loser? Either way, I am done listening to this pathetic fairy tale. I looked at my watch. The diamonds caught the light from the chandelier overhead. He is not imaginary, I said softly. And he is certainly not a loser. In fact, he should be arriving right about now. Trevor let out a loud mocking sigh. Right. Sure he is. I cannot wait to meet the invisible man. Maybe I can offer him a job cleaning the floors at my office, so you two can finally afford a decent meal. As the words left Trevor's mouth, a heavy authoritative knock echoed at the front oak door. 3 sharp raps that cut through the mocking laughter and silenced the room instantly. My mother frowned, glancing toward the hallway. Were you expecting someone, Calvin? No, my father whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the entryway. We did not invite anyone else. Monique swallowed hard, her bravado faltering for a fraction of a second before she forced a smile. It is probably just a delivery driver getting the address wrong. Let me go tell them to leave. She stood up from her chair, but I raised my hand, stopping her in her tracks. Do not bother, I said, my voice ringing with a cold, chilling promise. That is my husband, and trust me, you are going to want to open that door. The heavy wooden door stood between my family and the ultimate destruction of their reality. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had exposed my deepest shame. They had absolutely no idea that the man standing on the other side of that door was about to drag them into a nightmare of their own making. My father pushed his chair back slowly. The wood scraped against the dining room floor, sounding incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the house. He walked toward the entryway, his shoulders hunched, expecting a delivery driver who had lost his way or a neighbor needing a favor. We all watched his slow progression down the hall. Monique was holding her breath, her eyes narrowed in annoyance at the interruption. My mother had her arms crossed defensively, still wearing the cruel smirk from her deeply offensive toast. Trevor was still leaning back in his chair, maintaining that smug smile, certain that whoever was at the door would only prove their point and reinforce my humiliation. I sat perfectly still, keeping my breathing even, waiting for the exact moment their entire universe would turn upside down. The heavy oak door swung inward. A gust of freezing December wind swept into the warm foyer, but no one shivered from the cold. We were all completely frozen by the sight of the man standing on our welcome mat. It was Julian. He stepped into the bright light of the hallway and the entire atmosphere of the house immediately shifted. Julian Vance was 42 years old and he commanded physical and psychological space without having to say a single word. He was the absolute epitome of black excellence. He wore a custom midnight blue Tom Ford suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders and narrow waist. A crisp white shirt contrasted sharply with his flawless dark skin. He wore no tie. There was just an effortless, terrifying elegance about him that made everyone else in the room look unkempt and small. An expensive Peck Phipe watch rested on his left wrist, gleaming subtly under the light of my mother's prized foyer chandelier. His presence carried a gravitational pull that sucked the air right out of the room. Behind him, through the open doorway, the family could clearly see the long sleek silhouette of a black Maybach idling in the driveway. A uniformed chauffeur stood patiently by the open rear door, his breath visible in the freezing night air, waiting for a command. The brilliant headlights of the luxury vehicle cut through the dark suburban street, casting long dramatic shadows across the manicured lawn, making my parents' luxury cars look like cheap discarded toys in comparison. My father backed away from the door, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. Snorts. He had absolutely no idea who this towering man was. But the immense wealth and power radiating from Julian was so absolute it demanded immediate submission. My father, a man who usually demanded respect in his own home, simply shrank against the wall, unable to formulate a single coherent greeting. Monique stared from her seat at the table. Her smug, mocking expression vanished instantly, replaced by a wide-eyed ravenous hunger. She looked at the impeccable tailoring of the suit. She looked at the subtle flash of the luxury watch. She stretched her neck to look past him at the Maybach idling in the driveway. I could practically see the gears turning in her superficial mind, trying to figure out how a man of this incredible caliber had ended up standing on our front porch on Christmas Eve. She instinctively sat up a little straighter, pushing her chest out and smoothing her expensive dress, trying to draw his attention, trying to make herself the focal point of the room, as she always did. But the absolute best reaction by far belonged to Trevor. Trevor was sitting directly across from me. When Julian stepped out of the hallway and into the full light of the dining room, Trevor was raising his crystal glass of bourbon to his lips, ready to take a celebratory sip. After mocking my existence, he stopped abruptly. His pale face went completely white. The healthy color drained rapidly from his cheeks, his neck and his ears, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost appearing from the shadows to drag him straight to hell. His hand began to shake so violently that the ice cubes clinked cloudily against the sides of the crystal glass. Then his hand gave out entirely. The heavy glass slipped from his numb fingers and crashed down onto his dinner plate. The silver fork clattered against the fine china, making a sharp piercing noise that echoed off the walls. Brown bourbon splashed across his food and spilled wildly across my mother's precious holiday tablecloth, seeping into the expensive white fabric. Trevor did not even notice the mess he had just made. He could not breathe. He was actively suffocating on his own horrifying realization. Trevor knew exactly who Julian was. Anyone who worked in the upper echelons of commercial real estate knew the face of Julian Vance. Julian was the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. The man was a titan, an apex predator in the corporate world, a figure who appeared on magazine covers and commanded industry-shifting moves with a single phone call. And much more importantly, to Trevor, Julian was the brilliant architect of the hostile takeover that had just swallowed Trevor's entire firm whole. Just 20 minutes ago, Trevor had been bragging to the table about how Vanguard Holdings had acquired his company. He had been boasting about his middle management position, acting like he was an elite corporate player immune to the coming layoffs. Now, the supreme boss, the actual billionaire who held Trevor's entire career and livelihood in the palm of his hand, was standing in his mother-in-law's dining room. Trevor was sweating profusely. A thick drop of moisture rolled down his temple. He was completely paralyzed by the realization that he had just spent the last hour mocking, insulting, and deeply degrading the woman who claimed to be married to this man. He had offered the wife of a billionaire a minimum wage receptionist job. He had called her an unwanted failure. My mother, completely oblivious to Trevor's silent panic attack, stepped forward. She put on her best neighborhood hostess smile, the incredibly fake one she reserved exclusively for wealthy church members and local politicians she wanted to impress. "Hello," she said. Her voice overly sweet, high-pitched, and deeply confused. "Can we help you? Sir? Are you looking for someone in the neighborhood? Perhaps you have the wrong address." Julian did not look at her. He did not acknowledge her fake greeting. He did not look at my father, who was still hovering awkwardly by the coat rack, trying to make himself invisible. He completely ignored Monique, who was practically leaning over the dining table, desperate to catch his eye. And he certainly did not look at Trevor, who looked like he was about to pass out face first into his mashed potatoes. Julian's eyes locked entirely on me. His cold, authoritative expression melted instantly into something incredibly warm, tender, and intimate. He walked around the long dining table, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the polished hardwood floor. He stopped right beside my chair. I turned my head to look up at him, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my tired soul. For 38 years, I had fought my battles in this dining room, completely alone. I had absorbed every insult, every microaggression, every cruel joke without backup. Now I had an army of one standing firmly by my side. Julian reached down and gently cupped my face with his large warm hand. He leaned in and kissed me deeply right there in front of my stunned silent family. It was not a polite brief greeting between spouses. It was a massive territorial claim. It was an absolute undeniable declaration of devotion and ownership that shattered their entire perception of my life. He pulled back slightly, keeping his hands softly resting on the back of my neck, his thumb brushing affectionately against my skin. "Forgive me, Mrs. Vance," he said, his deep, rich voice filling the quiet dining room and echoing perfectly in the silent space. "I know I promised to be here for the first course. I got delayed at the downtown office. I had to sign off on the immediate termination of some severely underperforming middle managers." Across the table, Trevor physically flinched. He violently jerked backward in his chair as if he had been struck hard across the face with a heavy whip. The specific words "underperforming middle managers" hit him square in the chest, crushing the remaining air out of his lungs. Trevor swallowed hard, pulling frantically at his shirt collar, suddenly desperate for oxygen. His terrified eyes darted from Julian to me and back to Julian, completely consumed by blinding panic. Julian finally shifted his gaze. He slowly turned his head away from me and looked directly across the table at Trevor. The soft warmth in Julian's dark eyes vanished completely, replaced by the ruthless, predatory stare of a billionaire chief executive, evaluating a completely useless disposable asset. Julian did not say a single word to him. He just let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out, letting Trevor drown in his own agonizing panic. Trevor looked down at his ruined plate, unable to meet my husband's intense eyes, his shoulders shaking slightly. I reached up and placed my hand gently over Julian's. "It is perfectly fine, darling," I said, my voice incredibly smooth and relaxed, showing absolutely no signs of the tension that had filled the room moments before. "You are right on time. We were actually just having a lovely conversation about careers. Trevor here was actually just offering me a job as a front desk receptionist at his firm. He said it might get me out of my depressing apartment and give my pathetic life some actual purpose." Julian let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. "Is that so?" he asked softly, his eyes still pinned firmly on Trevor's pale, sweating face. "How incredibly generous of him to think of you. We will have to review his performance metrics thoroughly on Monday morning to see if he is even authorized to make hiring decisions for my company. Assuming, of course, that his department survives the weekend cuts." Trevor looked like he was going to throw up right there on the table. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg for his professional life, but absolutely no words came out. His vocal cords refused to work. He was completely and utterly broken, reduced to a trembling mess in front of his wife and in-laws. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display and looked at my mother. She was standing completely frozen near the head of the table, her hands gripping the back of a chair for support. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, darting frantically between Julian, the luxurious Maybach, sitting outside the custom-tailored suit, and the massive diamond ring I had just quietly pulled out of my purse and slipped back onto my left hand. I had hidden the rings in my bag before entering the house, knowing it would cause an unnecessary scene before I was ready. Now the flawless 10-carat diamond caught the light from the overhead chandelier, flashing brilliantly and sending prisms of light across the room. My mother's jaw was practically resting on the floor. Her brain was buffering, working in overdrive, trying desperately to process the impossible reality unfolding right in front of her eyes. She looked at me, the daughter she had just crew-toasted as the ultimate family failure. Then she looked at the billionaire holding me like I was the most precious, valuable thing in the entire world. I watched the exact moment the realization fully hit her. The cruel insult she had hurled at me just moments ago evaporated entirely from her mind. The mockery, the disdain, the deep-seated belief that she was superior to me vanished into thin air. In their place, a terrifying, highly calculated greed washed over her aging features. Her toxic maternal instinct pivoted instantly without a single moment of hesitation or remorse. She was no longer looking at a 3-8-year-old spinster daughter she could use as a punching bag. She was looking at a winning lottery ticket. She was looking at a walking, breathing, unlimited bank account that could fund her extravagant lifestyle and elevate her social status to unimaginable heights. The contrast between the cold winter air slipping through the open front door and the stifling heat of the dining room mirrored the sudden shift in our family dynamics. For decades, my mother had meticulously controlled the narrative of our lives. She had dictated who was successful and who was lacking, who deserved praise, and who deserved to be the butt of every holiday joke. She had built a throne for herself, and Monique constructed entirely out of my supposed failures. I had been the foundation of their self-esteem, the reliable disappointment they could always point to when they needed to feel better about their own shallow existence. But Julian's arrival had not just shaken that foundation, it had completely pulverized it. The sheer magnitude of his presence defied every lie they had ever told about me. The custom suit, the luxury car, the unbothered confidence of a man who controlled empires. It was all too big for them to dismiss or minimize. They could not gaslight me out of this reality. They could not twist this into a story where I was still the loser. Trevor's reaction was the most delicious confirmation of my new reality. Here was a man who had built his entire identity around his mediocre corporate job. He strutted around our family gatherings, wearing his average salary like a badge of supreme honor, treating my father with thinly veiled condescension, and treating me like an absolute peasant. He had married the golden child and assumed the role of the golden son-in-law, watching his fragile ego shatter into a million pieces, watching his arrogant posture crumble into genuine physical terror, was a level of poetic justice I had not even dared to dream of. He knew that Julian Vance did not just fire people, he ended careers. A single negative word from Julian could ensure Trevor never worked in commercial real estate again. And Trevor had just offered Julian's wife a minimum wage job out of pure spite. My father was still standing by the door, completely immobilized by his own cowardice. He had never been a man to take charge in a crisis, and this was the ultimate crisis of his carefully curated suburban life. He looked at Julian's chauffeur, who was still standing by the Maybach, and then looked at Julian, unsure if he should offer to take his coat, or offer him the deed to the house. His silence was deafening, but entirely expected. He was waiting for my mother to tell him how to feel, how to react, what script they were going to read from next. Monique was practically vibrating in her seat. The jealousy rolling off her was so thick, it was almost tangible. She had spent her entire life competing with me, even when I refused to participate in the competition. She had always won because the game was rigged by our parents. But suddenly, the prize money had changed. Her suburban house, her middle management husband, her carefully curated social media life. It all looked remarkably small and pathetic compared to the sheer power and wealth standing beside me. She glanced down at Trevor, who was still hyperventilating slightly, and her expression shifted to one of profound disgust. Her shining knight had just been reduced to a trembling peasant by a real king. I felt Julian's thumb continue to stroke the back of my neck, a steady, grounding rhythm that kept me anchored in the moment. He knew everything about them. I had never kept secrets from him about the emotional abuse I endured. He knew about the student loans I paid off myself. He knew about the times I was left out of family vacations. He knew about the cruel comments regarding my weight, my hair, my career choices. He had offered 100 times to step in to buy their debts and crush them to ruin Trevor's career long before Vanguard acquired his firm. But I had always asked him to wait. I wanted to handle them on my own terms. When I told him about this Christmas dinner, when I told him I was finally ready to introduce him, he had candled a trip to Dubai just to be here. He had orchestrated the hostile takeover of Trevor's firm a week prior purely as a side project just to ensure he had absolute leverage when he finally walked through this door. He was a man who protected what was his. And for 5 years, he had been quietly building a fortress around me, waiting for the day I was ready to let my family smash themselves against the walls. My mother took another slow, calculated step forward. Her rigid posture, changing her fake smile, widening into something deeply predatory and desperate. The intoxicating smell of unimaginable wealth had completely erased any sense of shame or embarrassment she might have felt. She was about to try and rewrite 38 years of emotional abuse, neglect, and public humiliation in a single desperate breath, preparing to play the role of the loving, supportive mother she had never been. She opened her mouth, ready to launch into a performance of maternal love and affection that would undoubtedly make me sick to my stomach. She was preparing to welcome Julian into the family, to claim him as her own son-in-law, to start laying the groundwork for the inevitable financial requests that would soon follow. She was going to try and rewrite history right here, right now, but she had no idea that Julian and I had anticipated this exact pivot. We knew her playbook inside and out, and we were entirely prepared to burn her new narrative to the ground before she even had the chance to speak it into existence. The real game had just begun, and my family was completely unarmed. My mother broke the silence with a high-pitched laugh that sounded like shattering glass. She took 2 frantic steps forward, holding her arms out as if she were about to embrace a man she had never met. Julian. Oh my goodness, what a truly wonderful surprise. She clasped her hands together, her rings catching the light. Roxanne has kept you entirely too hidden from us. You must forgive our shock, but we are simply thrilled. She did not wait for Julian to respond. She immediately turned her frantic energy toward my father, who was still pressed against the hallway wall. Calvin, do not just stand there. Go down to the cellar right now and get the good wine. Not the table wine we were drinking. Get the reserve bottles we have been saving for a special occasion. Move. My father practically scrambled over his own feet, rushing toward the kitchen like a frightened servant. My mother turned back to Julian, gesturing wildly toward the head of the dining table. Please come sit down. Have you eaten? Let me have Trevor move his chair so you can sit next to your beautiful wife. Trevor nearly tripped over his own legs, trying to push his chair back to make room. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, terrified of making direct eye contact with the man who owned his entire professional existence. Julian did not move toward the chair. He remained standing right beside me, his hand resting with a warm, heavy possessiveness on my lower back. He looked at my mother with a polite but absolutely freezing expression. Thank you for the offer, Brenda, but we will not be staying long enough to require a new seating arrangement. My mother waved her hand dismissively, choosing to ignore the clear boundary he had just drawn. Nonsense, you are family now. She smoothed the front of her expensive dress, her eyes sparkling with unadulterated greed. You know, I was just telling the table before you walked in how I always knew my Roxanne was destined for the absolute stars. I always told everyone she was a late bloomer, but that she had a brilliant future ahead of her. She took a step closer to us, her voice dropping into a tone of fake maternal intimacy. I pushed her so hard growing up because I saw her boundless potential. A mother just knows these things. I raised her to be fiercely independent. I taught her to be strong so that one day she could stand proudly beside a man of your incredible caliber. It is just so wonderful to see my hard work as a mother finally pay off like this. The sheer audacity of her lie made the air in my lungs turn to ice. She was standing there in front of the entire family, attempting to claim credit for the very survival mechanisms I had developed to protect myself from her emotional abuse. She wanted to look like the visionary matriarch who had carefully molded me into a billionaire's wife. I turned my head and looked directly into her greedy, desperate eyes. I let a cold, razor-sharp smile form on my lips. Raised me to be independent? I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. You mean when you forced me to take out $80,000 in crippling student loans at 19 because you claimed the family business was struggling to survive? You mean when you watched me work 3 different jobs just to pay for my textbooks while you secretly handed Monique that exact same amount in cash for the down payment on her first house? The color instantly drained from my mother's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Across the table, Monique gasped, her face turning a deep shade of crimson as the dirty secret of her supposed financial independence was laid bare in front of my husband. You were always so stubborn, Roxanne, Monique stammered, trying desperately to defend the indefensible. Mom was just teaching you financial responsibility. You needed to learn the value of $1. Julian shifted his stance slightly. He did not raise his voice, but the lethal calm in his tone commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. Financial responsibility is an interesting concept, he said, his dark eyes fixing squarely on Monique. It is fascinating how it is usually taught by those who have never had to practice it and forced upon those who cannot afford the lesson. Monique snapped her mouth shut, shrinking back into her chair. Trevor, seeing his wife humiliated and likely feeling the desperate need to salvage some microscopic shred of his own masculinity, decided to make the worst mistake of his entire life. He stood up, smoothing his tie with shaking hands, attempting to switch his demeanor from a terrified subordinate to a confident corporate peer. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile and extended a trembling hand toward Julian across the table. Mr. Vance, Trevor said, his voice cracking slightly on the first syllable. It truly is an honor to finally meet you in person. I am Trevor, Monique's husband. We are practically colleagues in the commercial real estate sector. My division at the firm handles a significant portfolio of downtown assets, and I have been following Vanguard's recent acquisitions very closely. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Julian looked at Trevor's extended, trembling hand. He did not reach out to take it. He simply let Trevor stand there, his arms suspended awkwardly over the ruined tablecloth while the seconds ticked by in agonizing slow motion. Julian looked Trevor up and down with the kind of clinical detachment a scientist might use to observe a highly unremarkable insect. Colleagues. Julian repeated the word, tasting it on his tongue as if it were something entirely foreign. That implies we operate on the same level. Trevor's extended hand began to shake more violently. He slowly lowered it to his side, his face burning bright red. Tell me, Trevor. Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. As my employee, do you make it a habit of offering minimum wage receptionist jobs to the wives of the executives who sign your paychecks? Or is that highly specialized level of career guidance reserved exclusively for my wife? Trevor looked like he might actually faint. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of his chair. No, sir. He stammered, the sweat visibly pouring down his forehead. I did not know I was making a joke. It was just family banter. I swear I meant no disrespect to you or to Roxanne. Julian did not blink. He stepped marginally closer to the table, towering over Trevor's crumbling posture. You will address her as Mrs. Vance in my presence, he commanded softly. And for your sake, you better pray that your quarterly performance metrics are significantly better than your sense of humor. Trevor collapsed back into his chair, utterly destroyed. Monique tried to reach out and rub his arm, but he flinched away from her touch, staring blankly at his spilled bourbon. He had tried to play the big shot, and Julian had casually, ruthlessly reminded him that he was nothing more than a disposable line item on a corporate spreadsheet. My father returned from the cellar at that exact moment, carrying 2 dusty bottles of expensive wine. He stopped in the doorway, sensing the radioactive tension that had completely taken over the dining room. He looked at Trevor's defeated posture, at my mother's pale, terrified face, and at Julian standing next to me like an impenetrable fortress. Ah, my father said weakly, holding up the bottles. I found the reserve. What followed was the most suffocating, agonizing dinner I had ever experienced. And yet, I savored every single second of it. My parents scrambled to set a place for Julian, treating the fine china like it was explosive. Julian sat beside me, keeping his posture relaxed, but completely guarded. He was an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare. My mother, desperate to regain some semblance of control over the narrative, tried repeatedly to force small talk. She asked Julian about his golf handicap. She asked about the charity galas he attended. She tried dropping the names of local politicians she had met once at a fundraiser, hoping to speak his language. Julian answered her with polite monosyllabic responses that offered absolutely zero opening for further conversation. He built a wall of ice around us that my mother simply could not penetrate. When my father nervously asked about the real estate market, Julian gave him a brief, highly technical answer that completely went over my father's head, forcing him to nod along in silent, embarrassed agreement. For the first time in 38 years, I ate my Christmas dinner with a genuine appetite. The food tasted incredible, not because of my mother's cooking, but because it was seasoned with the absolute defeat of my abusers. I watched Monique pick at her food, her eyes darting constantly toward Julian's custom watch and the massive diamond on my left hand. She was seething with a quiet, venomous jealousy that she could not safely express. Her entire identity was built on being better than me, and tonight that identity had been permanently shattered. Trevor did not eat a single bite. He drank 3 glasses of water, staring straight ahead, likely calculating exactly how fast he could update his resume before Monday morning. As the dessert plates were being cleared, Julian turned to me with a soft, genuine smile that was meant only for me. "Are you ready to go, my love?" he asked. I nodded, placing my napkin on the table. "We really should be heading out," I announced to the room. "Julian has an early flight tomorrow and I have some crisis management files to review for a client." My mother practically leapt out of her chair, her panic returning instantly. "Leaving so soon, but we have not even opened the presents yet. We have not taken the family photos by the tree. You cannot just leave right after we finally get to meet your husband. We have a strict schedule to keep, Brenda," Julian said, standing up and pulling my chair out for me with effortless grace. "But thank you for your profound hospitality tonight. It has been incredibly illuminating to see exactly where my wife gets her remarkable resilience." It was a beautiful, flawlessly delivered insult wrapped in a compliment. My mother smiled tightly, unable to argue without looking worse. Julian helped me into my tailored winter coat, his hands resting protectively on my shoulders as we turned away from the dining room and walked toward the grand foyer. The air felt lighter the closer we got to the front door. I was walking away from my childhood trauma, leaving them to choke on the bitter reality of my success. But as Julian reached for the brass handle of the front door, the heavy sound of footsteps hurried down the hallway behind us. "Wait. Please wait a second." We turned around to see Trevor and Monique practically running to catch up with us. The sheer desperation in their eyes was thick and palpable. Trevor was sweating again, his tie slightly loosened, his hands rubbing together nervously. Monique had plastered on a bright, pleading smile that looked completely unnatural on her face. They stepped directly in front of the door, physically blocking our exit. Julian raised one perfect eyebrow, his expression hardening into warning. "Can we help you, Trevor?" Trevor swallowed hard, glancing quickly at Monique for courage. "Julian." "Sir, before you head out into the cold, Monique and I were hoping to pull you aside for just a brief moment. We know the timing is highly unorthodox given the holiday, but we have a rather urgent private family business proposal. We would absolutely love to run by you." Trevor stood there blocking the heavy oak door, his chest puffed out in a desperate attempt to project a confidence he absolutely did not possess. He was trying to invoke some invisible bond of white male corporate brotherhood, acting as though he and Julian were simply two titans of industry who had just met at an exclusive country club. He completely ignored me, the woman he had just publicly humiliated, and focused his entire pathetic existence on my husband. "Julian, listen." Trevor started dropping the formal title he had used in the dining room and attempting a casual familiar tone that made my skin crawl. "Since Vanguard just acquired my firm and we are all family now, I think we have a highly unique opportunity here to create some incredible synergy. I have been leading the commercial division for 3 years. I know the local market better than anyone. With the upcoming restructuring, I think it makes perfect sense to keep the executive leadership in the family. The executive vice president position is opening up and I am your guy. I can be your eyes and ears on the ground here in Atlanta." I watched his sheer unadulterated delusion unfold in real time. Trevor actually believed that marrying my sister gave him a VIP pass to my husband's empire. He was sweating his tie askew, begging for a job while trying to dress it up as a strategic business proposal. He wanted to leapfrog over hundreds of far more qualified executives simply because he happened to be standing in my mother's hallway on Christmas Eve. Before Julian could even respond to this monumental display of arrogance, Monique shoved her husband slightly to the side, refusing to let him monopolize the billionaire in the room. She was not going to let Trevor secure a bag without getting her own hands in the vault. She ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair and offered Julian a bright predatory smile, batting her eyelashes as she stepped directly into his personal space. "Actually, Julian," Monique said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "Trevor's corporate stuff is boring. I have something much more exciting to talk to you about. I am launching a luxury lifestyle and wellness brand. It is going to be massive. I am talking high-end curated experiences, organic skincare, exclusive retreats. I have the entire vision mapped out in my head. I just need the right financial partner to get it off the ground. Since you are essentially my brother-in-law now, I wanted to give you the first right of refusal. A $2 million seed investment would easily cover the initial launch, and I am willing to give you a 10% stake in the company." I stared at my younger sister, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of her audacity. She had no business plan. She had no revenue model. She had no supply chain or manufacturing contacts. She had absolutely nothing but a vague collection of buzzwords she had read in a fashion magazine and an ego the size of a small planet. She was casually asking my husband for $2 million, like she was asking to borrow a cup of sugar from a neighbor, all while attempting to use the exact same superficial charm she had always used to manipulate our weak-willed father. Julian looked down at them with a mixture of profound clinical disgust and scientific curiosity. He looked like a man watching two desperate rats fighting over a crumb of poisoned bread. His jaw tightened and I could feel the suppressed lethal energy radiating off his body. He was fully prepared to absolutely obliterate them right there in the hallway, to strip away every last shred of their dignity and leave them crying on the floor. But I could not let him do it. This was my family. This was my battlefield. And I was the one who was going to drop the guillotine. I stepped forward, placing myself directly between my greedy, parasitic sister and my fiercely protective husband. I looked at Monique and let a cold, dead smile touch my lips. "Monique," I said, my voice dropping into a register so dangerously quiet that she physically recoiled. 30 minutes ago, I was an ugly spinster. You do not ask spinsters for seed money. You do not ask the family failure to fund your imaginary lifestyle brand. And even if I were inclined to help you, A $2 million investment for a 10% stake implies a $20 million valuation for a company that does not even exist outside of your deeply delusional head. The answer is no. Now and forever. Monique's mouth fell open, her fake smile shattering into 1,000 pieces of pure unadulterated shock. She looked at me as if I had just slapped her across the face. I turned my eyes to Trevor, who was visibly sweating through his expensive dress shirt, his breathing shallow and rapid. And Trevor, I continued watching the terror reignite in his pale eyes. If you want a promotion to executive vice president, I highly suggest you try meeting your Q3 quotas instead of begging your brother-in-law to save you from your own overwhelming mediocrity. Vanguard's compliance team already flagged your portfolio for chronic underperformance last month. You are not getting a promotion, Trevor. You will be lucky if you are not clearing out your desk by next Friday. Trevor let out a strange strangled gasp, stepping backward until his spine hit the floral wallpaper of the hallway. The realization that I not only knew about his failing metrics, but actually had direct access to Vanguard's internal corporate data completely broke him. He was a fraud and he knew that I knew it. The heavy wooden doors of the dining room suddenly burst open wider. My mother came storming down the hallway, her face twisted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure narcissistic rage. She had been lingering just out of sight, eavesdropping on the entire exchange, desperately waiting for Julian to hand over a blank check. When she heard me shut down the vault, her carefully constructed hostess facade completely disintegrated. "You selfish little monster," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully in the confined space of the entryway. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes burning with decades of toxic hatred. "How dare you speak to your sister and your brother-in-law that way? Who do you think you are? You bring a wealthy man into my home and suddenly you think you are better than us." I did not flinch. I stood my ground, meeting her furious gaze with absolute unshakable calm. "I do not think I am better than you, Mom," I said evenly. "I simply know my own worth, and I know exactly what you are all truly worth. We are your family," my mother shrieked, taking another aggressive step forward. Her hands were curled into tight fists, trembling with the desire to strike me. "We share the same blood. When one of us succeeds, we all succeed. That is how a family works, Roxanne. We support each other. Your husband has more money than God, and you are going to deny your own sister a tiny little loan to build her future. You owe us. You owe this family for everything we have done for you." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of a daughter's love, any small fragment of pity or sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing. There was just a vast empty void where my affection for her used to reside. "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice echoing with icy finality. "You made sure I knew exactly what I was worth to you for 38 years. You priced my value at zero. You mocked me. You belittled me. You set me up to fail so you could feel powerful. Now you get to live with the exchange rate you established. Do not ever ask me or my husband for anything ever again." My mother let out a frustrated, enraged scream, a sound of pure primal defeat. She lunged forward as if she were going to physically grab me, but Julian moved with terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly in front of me, using his large frame as an impenetrable shield. He did not raise his hands. He did not make a single threatening gesture, but the sheer dark menace radiating from his posture stopped my mother dead in her tracks. She froze, staring up at the billionaire who looked fully prepared to destroy her entire existence if she took one more step toward his wife. "We are leaving," Julian said, his voice low and vibrating with a lethal promise. "If any of you ever attempt to contact my wife again, I will make sure the consequences are catastrophic and entirely permanent. Do you understand me, Brenda?" My mother could not speak. She simply stared at him, her chest heaving with angry, ragged breaths, completely overpowered by a man she could not manipulate or control. Julian turned smoothly, opening the heavy front door and letting the freezing winter wind rush into the suffocating hallway. He guided me out onto the porch, his hand resting protectively on the small of my back as we walked down the brick steps toward the idling Maybach. The cold air felt incredibly clean and refreshing against my face, washing away the toxic stench of my childhood home. The uniformed chauffeur immediately stepped forward, opening the heavy rear door for me with a respectful nod. As I slid into the plush, warm leather seat, the luxurious interior of the car wrapped around me like a secure protective vault. Julian slid in beside me, his large presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of safety. The heavy car door shut with a solid definitive click, severing my physical connection to the house and the people inside it. But my mother was not done. She could not handle being the loser. She burst out of the front door and onto the freezing porch, wearing only her thin holiday dress, completely ignoring the biting winter wind through the heat of her absolute fury. She ran to the edge of the steps, gripping the wooden railing with white knuckles. "Rich men do not stay with dry, selfish women like you," she screamed into the winter night, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated spite and desperation. "He will figure out exactly what kind of failure you are, Roxanne. You will end up alone. You hear me? You will die alone." I did not look back at her. I simply reached over and took Julian's hand, intertwining my fingers with his. The chauffeur smoothly shifted the Maybach into gear, and the massive luxury vehicle glided silently away from the curb, leaving my mother screaming her bitter curses into the empty suburban street. Back inside the brightly lit house, the warm ambient glow of the foyer illuminated Monique. She had not followed our mother out onto the freezing porch. She was not comforting her humiliated mother or tending to her completely destroyed husband, who was still leaning against the hallway wall, staring blankly into space. Monique was standing alone in the center of the foyer, furiously scrolling through her smartphone. Her eyes were dark, calculating, and utterly consumed by a deeply toxic delusion. She was navigating through corporate directories and social media profiles, deliberately plotting how to bypass my boundaries and contact Julian privately. In her twisted narcissistic mind, she fully believed she was the superior sister, the beautiful golden child who deserved the billionaire lifestyle. As she searched for his private contact information, a malicious, greedy smile touched her lips. Absolutely determined to reach out and show the wealthy CEO what a real woman actually looked like. The days following that Christmas dinner were predictably chaotic. My mother could not simply accept defeat. She had built her entire identity on being the flawless matriarch of a perfect suburban family. Losing that absolute control over meant she had to invent an entirely new narrative to save her precious reputation. The whispers began circulating through the elite social circles and the affluent church groups of Atlanta almost immediately. I worked in crisis management public relations, so naturally I had eyes and ears everywhere in the city. It did not take long for my extensive network to report back exactly what my mother and sister were saying about me behind my back. According to Brenda, I was a manipulative monster who had coldly abandoned her loving family. The story they spun was entirely fabricated, but incredibly vicious in its delivery. They told everyone willing to listen that I had trapped Julian with a fake pregnancy 5 years ago to force him into a secret marriage. When the imaginary baby never arrived, I supposedly isolated him from his peers, using my professional public relations skills to completely brainwash him. But the most pathetic lie was their claim about financial abuse. My mother sat in the front pews of her megachurch, crying fake tears while telling her wealthy friends that I was starving my own parents. She claimed I was hoarding Julian's billions while actively trying to force my elderly mother and father out onto the freezing streets. Monique was fully complicit in spreading this toxic garbage across the city. She attended her weekly brunch dates complaining loudly about how her evil older sister was destroying the family legacy. It was a spectacular display of absolute delusion. They genuinely believed that by controlling the local gossip, they could somehow manifest my ultimate downfall. I did not intervene at all. I did not send cease and desist letters through my legal team. I simply sat in my sleek corner office downtown, reviewing the intelligence reports my team brought me and letting them dig their own massive graves. I knew that desperate people always made critical mistakes, and Monique was the most desperate person of all. Her monumental mistake came exactly 3 weeks later. Vanguard Holdings was hosting its annual winter charity gala at the most exclusive museum venue in downtown Atlanta. It was a highly restricted black tie event reserved strictly for the absolute top tier of the corporate hierarchy and wealthy local philanthropists. Julian was scheduled to attend the event and deliver the keynote address regarding urban development. I, on the other hand, had deliberately booked a flight to New York for a high-profile client emergency. My public relations firm made sure my travel itinerary was casually leaked to the right social media channels. I knew Monique monitored my digital footprint obsessively every single day. I knew she would see that Julian was attending the gala completely alone while his wife was hundreds of miles away in another state. Monique saw this as her ultimate golden window of opportunity. In her twisted narcissistic reality, she honestly believed she was the superior sister in every conceivable way. She thought Julian was only with me because he had never been properly introduced to a younger, more vibrant alternative. She was fully convinced that if she could just get him alone without my supposedly suffocating presence, She could show him exactly what he was missing. But Monique had no standing to attend a billionaire charity gala. She was not a philanthropist, and she was certainly not on the approved security guest list. This was where Trevor made the fatal decision that would permanently end his professional life. Trevor was currently drowning in a sea of intense corporate anxiety. Ever since that Christmas dinner, he had been walking on eggshells at work, terrified that human resources would tap him on the shoulder at any given moment. Instead of keeping his head down and doing his job properly, he decided to play a desperate, foolish game of corporate espionage to please his demanding wife. He still possessed his middle management security clearance badge for Vanguard Holdings. Using a massive breach of company protocol, Trevor accessed the internal event management system from his office computer. He manually bypassed the strict security protocols and added his wife to the approved vendor access list under a fake catering company profile. He actively risked federal fraud and corporate trespassing charges just to sneak through the heavily guarded service entrance of the museum. Monique did not enter the gala looking anything like a caterer. She slipped into a downstairs staff bathroom and changed into a dress that was entirely inappropriate for a prestigious corporate charity event. She wore a skin-tight crimson gown with a plunging neckline and a slit that rode dangerously high up her thigh. She coated herself in heavy, expensive perfume and reapplied a thick layer of bright red lipstick. She believed she looked like an irresistible temptress ready to conquer a billionaire executive. In reality, she looked like a desperate amateur, completely out of place among the understated elegant wealth of the room. She spent the first hour of the gala stalking the perimeter of the massive ballroom, hiding behind massive floral arrangements and towering ice sculptures. She watched Julian navigate the room with his usual terrifying grace, shaking hands with state senators and tech moguls. She was waiting patiently for the perfect moment of total isolation. That moment finally came when Julian stepped away from the main crowd to take a private phone call near a secluded balcony overlooking the city skyline. The balcony was dimly lit, surrounded by heavy velvet curtains, providing the exact illusion of privacy Monique had been hunting for all night. She grabbed 2 crystal flutes of champagne from a passing waiter and positioned herself in the dark shadows. She pulled out her smartphone, unlocking the bright screen and opening the camera application. Her plan was incredibly transparent and deeply pathetic. She intended to corner him, press her scantily clad body against him, and accidentally spill the sticky alcohol all over herself. In the ensuing chaos, she would snap a series of carefully angled photos, making it look like they were engaged in an intimate, compromising embrace. She planned to use those photos to either blackmail me into handing over millions of dollars, or to convince the local media that Julian was having a sordid affair with his younger, prettier sister-in-law. Monique took a deep breath, pushed her shoulders back, and stepped out onto the cold stone balcony. She walked with an exaggerated sway, her high heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Julian was standing with his back to her, looking out over the glittering city lights, his phone pressed firmly to his ear. He was actually on the phone with me, discussing my flight back from New York. Monique closed the physical distance between them. She did not say a single word of greeting. She simply lunged forward, throwing her weight directly into his broad back while simultaneously tipping the champagne glasses backward. The golden liquid splashed violently across her exposed chest and down the front of her expensive crimson dress. She let out a loud theatrical gasp, dropping the empty crystal flutes onto the stone floor, where they shattered into a dozen sharp pieces. "Oh my goodness, Julian, I am so incredibly sorry." She purred, her voice dripping with artificial panic and poorly acted distress. She aggressively crowded into his personal space, reaching her sticky hands out to grab his tailored suit jacket. She pressed her soaked chest against his arm, lifting her phone with her other hand, ready to snap the compromising photograph that would secure her financial future. But Julian did not flinch. He did not stumble backward in surprise. He did not rush to help her clean up the mess. He did not offer her his jacket or look at her exposed skin. Julian stood as still and solid as a concrete pillar. He slowly lowered his phone from his ear, but he did not end the call. I could hear absolutely everything happening through the open line in my quiet hotel room. Julian turned his head and looked down at Monique. The expression on his face was not shock or temptation or even mild amusement. It was absolute unfiltered revulsion. He looked at her the exact same way one might look at a diseased rat that had just crawled out of a sewer grate. There was no anger in his dark eyes, only a profound chilling disgust. Monique froze entirely. The predatory smile on her face faltered as the freezing temperature of his stare paralyzed her completely. Her phone hovered uselessly in the air. the camera lens capturing nothing but her own monumental failure. Julian took one single deliberate step backward, completely removing himself from her physical proximity. He raised his free hand and snapped his fingers exactly once. Before Monique could even process what was happening, the heavy velvet curtains parted instantly. Two massive men in dark suits stepped onto the balcony. They were Julian's elite personal security detail, and they had been watching her erratic behavior since the moment she bypassed the catering entrance downstairs. They moved with silent military precision. "Escort this unauthorized individual off the premises," Julian commanded, his voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of any human emotion. "Ensure she is removed through the front lobby so the event photographers can document her exit. If she resists, involve the local authorities for criminal trespassing." Monique let out a strangled cry of pure public humiliation. "Julian, please wait. I was just trying to talk to you. We are family." Julian did not even blink at her pathetic plea. "We are absolutely nothing," he stated, his voice slicing through the cold night air like a surgical scalpel. "You are a biological accident that my wife had the misfortune of sharing a childhood with. Do not ever approach me again." The security guards did not give her a chance to argue or negotiate. Each man grabbed one of her arms with unbreakable iron grips, lifting her slightly off the marble floor. They dragged her backward off the balcony and straight through the crowded, brightly lit ballroom. Hundreds of the wealthiest, most influential people in Atlanta stopped their elegant conversations to watch a soaking wet, hysterical woman in a ruined red dress being physically forcibly removed from the elite charity gala. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. As the heavy glass doors of the museum closed firmly behind her, Monique was unceremoniously dumped onto the freezing pavement outside. Camera flashes blinded her as the local paparazzi captured her miserable, sticky exit from the most important social event of the year. She screamed into the cold night air, her pristine high society image permanently shattered completely, consumed by a toxic vow to destroy Julian and me, no matter the eventual cost. Across the street, hiding in the damp shadows of a concrete parking garage, Trevor watched the tail lights of the paparazzi vehicles fade into the freezing Atlanta night. He clutched his Vanguard corporate badge like a physical lifeline, his breathing ragged and shallow as a cold sweat broke out across his back. His wife Monique was sobbing hysterically on the dirty pavement. But Trevor could not bring himself to step out of the shadows to comfort her. He had bypassed federal security protocols to let a lunatic assault his billionaire boss. Staring at his trembling hands, Trevor realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he had just committed professional suicide. He was completely paralyzed by a profound, suffocating terror because his own carefully constructed universe was currently collapsing around his neck. The truth was that the pristine, flawless, affluent lifestyle Trevor and Monique paraded around at family dinners was a complete and utter fabrication. They were drowning in a toxic ocean of insurmountable debt. The sprawling 5-bedroom house in the upscale suburbs that my mother praised so highly was currently 3 months behind on its massive mortgage payments. The luxury vehicles parked in their driveway were leased on predatory terms that Trevor could no longer afford. Monique spent thousands of dollars every single month on designer clothes, organic skincare, and extravagant brunches just to maintain the fragile illusion of wealth among her shallow, highly critical friend group. She believed that acting wealthy would eventually make her wealthy. But the deepest, darkest secret of their marriage was the private financial terror Trevor was currently hiding from everyone. In a desperate bid to maintain his status as the successful golden son-in-law and the ultimate corporate provider, he had borrowed heavily from private unregulated lenders. These were not corporate bankers who sent polite past due notices in the mail. These were dangerous, ruthless men who operated in the violent shadows of the city. Men who did not care about corporate titles or suburban facades. Men who demanded their exorbitant interest payments in cash and threatened severe physical consequences when those payments were delayed. Trevor finally stepped out of the cold garage and rushed to his shivering wife. He practically shoved her into the passenger seat of their leased BMW, ignoring her bitter tears and angry rants about how unfair the world was. As he started the engine, his phone vibrated violently in the center console. A bright text message illuminated the dark interior of the luxury car. Snorts. It was from a local blocked number. The message was incredibly brief and absolutely terrifying. It demanded $200,000 by the end of the business week, or they would come to collect the debt directly from his beautiful, talkative wife. Trevor swallowed hard, feeling the bitter acidic taste of bile rising in the back of his throat. He gripped the leather steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white. He had absolutely no money left. His savings accounts were completely depleted and his credit scores were utterly destroyed. He was a dead man walking. The weekend passed in a blur of panic and despair. Monday morning arrived with a suffocating heavy dread. Trevor walked into his commercial real estate office, feeling completely numb. His mind was racing frantically, searching for any possible exit strategy. He sat at his sleek desk, staring blankly at the glowing computer monitor. That was when a deeply toxic, completely delusional thought planted itself in his desperate, scrambling brain. He was family. He was legally bound to the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. Julian Vance might despise him personally, but Julian was still married to Roxanne. And Roxanne, despite her cold exterior, was still a member of the family bloodline. Trevor convinced himself that billionaire men like Julian cared about one thing above all else, and that was their pristine, untouchable public image. Julian would absolutely never allow his own brother-in-law to be publicly destroyed by violent loan sharks or dragged into a messy, highly publicized bankruptcy scandal. The negative press would be too embarrassing for the Vanguard corporate empire. Julian would be forced to quietly cover up any indiscretion to protect his own flawless reputation. Fueled by this monumental delusion, Trevor decided to cross the line from corporate incompetence directly into federal felony territory. He logged into the highly secure internal loan approval system. Vanguard Holdings processed hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial acquisitions every single day. A few hundred, 000 would be absolutely nothing but a minor rounding error in their massive quarterly reports. Trevor utilized his middle management administrative access to locate a series of stalled commercial development projects in the lower income districts of the city. These were projects that had been flagged for further review and temporarily frozen by the corporate compliance department. They were the perfect invisible targets. Trevor began drafting the fraudulent authorization forms with shaking, sweaty hands. He created a series of dummy vendor accounts, registering them under incredibly vague corporate names that linked directly back to his own offshore shell companies. He needed a signature, a final executive override to release the funds from the tightly guarded corporate treasury. Trevor pulled up a digital copy of Julian Vance's official executive signature from a recent company-wide memorandum. Using basic digital manipulation software, he carefully grafted the billionaire's signature onto the bottom of his fraudulent loan approvals. But Trevor knew a simple signature might trigger an automated security review. He needed an airtight, unquestionable justification. He typed out a formal directive declaring himself as the personal proxy for the Vanguard CEO. He specifically added aggressive legal language, stating that these funds were being expedited directly under the personal orders of Julian Vance for confidential family business developments. He clicked the submit button. The system buffered for 3 agonizing seconds before flashing a bright green approved notification. The funds were instantly released from the Vanguard corporate treasury and wired directly into Trevor's hidden accounts. He sat back in his ergonomic office chair, letting out a long, shaky breath of profound relief. He had done it. He immediately transferred the required $200,000 to the private lenders, paying off his dangerous, life-threatening debt in full. He transferred another $50,000 to his personal checking account just to give Monique some spending money to keep her quiet and happy. He felt a sudden massive surge of unearned arrogant power. He actually believed he had outsmarted the massive corporate system. He believed he had forced the billionaire to unwittingly finance his fake affluent lifestyle. Trevor had absolutely no idea that Vanguard Holdings utilized one of the most advanced artificial intelligence security protocols on the entire planet. He had no idea that claiming to be the personal proxy of the CEO triggered an immediate silent alarm in the highest security division of the company. Across the city in the elite financial district, I sat behind the massive mahogany desk of my private corner office. The walls of my crisis management, public relations firm were lined with soundproof glass offering a sweeping panoramic view of the bustling Atlanta skyline. I wore a tailored white silk suit, my hair pulled back into a severe flawless bun. I was currently reviewing a delicate strategy to salvage the reputation of a disgraced tech mogul when my secure private server chimed with a high-priority notification. It was not a message from a client. It was an encrypted file transfer directly from the Vanguard Holdings Executive Compliance and Security Division. I clicked the decryption key and opened the digital dossier. The title of the file brought a cold, predatory smile to my painted lips. It read Security Breach Level 1 Trevor Davis. I leaned back in my plush leather chair and began to read through the forensic accounting report. The compliance team had meticulously documented every single keystroke, every fraudulent transfer, every pathetic attempt at digital forgery that Trevor had committed over the past 48 hours. They had traced the dummy accounts directly back to his personal banking records. They even tracked the massive wire transfer he sent to the known associates of a dangerous local lending syndicate. I shook my head in genuine disbelief at the sheer magnitude of his stupidity. Trevor had actually typed the words personal proxy for the Vanguard CEO onto a federal financial document. He had attached my husband's forged signature to a blatant act of corporate embezzlement. He had stolen $250,000 from a man who could legally crush him into dust with a single phone call. And the most pathetic part of it all was that I knew exactly why he did it. I knew the psychological mechanics of his arrogant, fragile ego. He honestly believed that the sacred shield of family blood would protect him from the severe consequences of his own criminal actions. He thought my mother's tears and my sister's tantrums would somehow force Julian to quietly sweep the stolen money under the rug to avoid a public family scandal. They had spent my entire 38 years of life treating me like a disposable failure. They had mocked my quiet lifestyle. They had laughed at my perceived loneliness. Now, the golden son-in-law, the man my mother proudly paraded around as the ultimate standard of success, had just handed me the loaded weapon I needed to permanently destroy their entire fake reality. I did not feel a single drop of pity for him. I did not feel any lingering sense of sisterly duty toward Monique, who was actively enjoying the stolen money at this very moment, buying designer shoes while her husband committed federal felonies. All I felt was the smooth, cold satisfaction of impending absolute justice. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office swung open silently. Julian stepped into the room, bypassing my executive assistant with the casual commanding authority of a man who owned the entire building. He wore a dark charcoal suit that accentuated his imposing athletic frame. He walked around my large desk and leaned his hip against the polished mahogany edge, looking down at the glowing computer monitor. He had received the exact same compliance report simultaneously on his own secure network. Julian crossed his arms over his broad chest. His dark eyes were completely unreadable, a deep, dangerous calm that always preceded a massive corporate slaughter. He looked at the forensic evidence of Trevor's federal crimes and then shifted his intense gaze down to my face. He reached out and gently traced the line of my jaw with his thumb, a gesture of absolute devotion mixed with lethal intent. He has committed wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and identity theft. Julian stated, his voice a low, smooth rumble that vibrated pleasantly in the quiet room. The compliance directors are waiting for my final authorization to contact the federal authorities. I can have the police waiting at his desk before he even returns from his lunch break. But since he is technically your family, I am leaving the execution method entirely up to you. Tell me how you want to handle them. Roxanne. I looked up at my brilliant, ruthless husband. I reached out and gently closed the laptop screen, hiding the digital evidence of Trevor's monumental failure. I let a slow, dark smirk pull at the corners of my mouth. I stood up from my chair, closing the physical distance between us, and slid the printed copy of the fraud file slowly across the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. Do not call the police yet, I said softly, my voice dripping with cold, calculated anticipation. Arresting him quietly at his cubicle is far too easy. Let us give them the biggest stage possible to hang themselves. Julian agreed with my assessment completely. He understood that simply sending Trevor to federal prison would only allow my mother to play the role of the grieving, tragic victim in her social circles. She would spin a narrative of a ruthless billionaire son-in-law who mercilessly destroyed her family over a simple misunderstanding. We could not allow them to control the narrative. We needed to orchestrate a public execution so flawless and so transparent that they would never be able to show their faces in Atlanta high society again. The trap required the perfect bait. 3 days later, a private courier in a crisp black uniform arrived at the front door of my parents' suburban home. He carried a heavy matte black envelope sealed with a thick stamp of gold wax bearing the official crest of Vanguard Holdings. Inside the envelope was a solid metal invitation engraved with pure gold lettering. It was an exclusive VIP summon to the Vanguard Holdings 10-year anniversary gala. It was the absolute most anticipated corporate event of the decade. The invitation was specifically addressed to Calvin and Brenda, granting them elite all-access passes reserved strictly for the direct family of the chief executive officer. A second identical courier arrived at Monique and Trevor's heavily mortgaged home, delivering the exact same breathtaking invitation. I sat in my downtown office watching the tracking notifications confirm delivery on my computer monitor. I knew exactly how they would react. I could easily picture the frantic phone calls and the high-pitched screaming echoing between my mother and my sister. They were incredibly predictable in their toxic narcissism. They did not view this invitation as a polite olive branch or a generous gesture of familial reconciliation. In their deeply delusional minds, they saw this as an absolute surrender. My mother immediately convinced herself that my father's previous complaints and her own public shaming tactics had finally worked. She honestly believed that Julian had realized the supreme importance of family bloodlines and had forced me to extend the invitation against my bitter, jealous wishes. She probably told her entire church congregation that her billionaire son-in-law had finally recognized her inherent value as the family matriarch. Monique took the delusion a massive step further. Her narcissistic brain completely erased the freezing humiliation she had suffered on the museum balcony just a few weeks prior. She genuinely convinced herself that Julian had been secretly tempted by her aggressive seduction attempt. She believed he had invited her to the anniversary gala so she could stand in the spotlight where she truly belonged. She thought I was finally being pushed out of the picture so the golden child could take her rightful place beside the billionaire king. But Trevor had the most dangerous and pathetic delusion of them all. When Trevor opened that heavy black envelope, his hands shook with profound unearned relief. He looked at the gold lettering, and his panicked mind instantly rationalized his federal crimes. He thought his fraudulent corporate loans had been successfully processed and buried. He actually believed that Julian was silently rewarding his bold, aggressive initiative. Trevor convinced himself that true titans of industry respected men who took what they wanted. He thought the VIP gala invitation was Julian's secret way of welcoming him into the absolute upper echelon of the corporate brotherhood. Trevor felt completely untouchable. The anniversary gala was exactly 1 week away, and my family spent every single second of that week digging themselves deeper into a massive financial grave. They were determined to look the part of a billionaire family, regardless of the catastrophic cost. They had no idea that I had hired private investigators to monitor their movements leading up to the event. The reports I received were absolutely hilarious and deeply pathetic. Trevor and Monique were completely broke, but they maxed out 3 brand new high-interest credit cards just to prepare for the single evening. Monique rented a breathtaking $10,000 designer gown from an exclusive boutique in Buckhead. She hired a celebrity makeup artist and a personal hair stylist, demanding the absolute premium bridal package. Trevor visited a custom tailor and rented a tuxedo that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. He even went to a luxury car rental service and booked a massive stretch limousine complete with a private driver and a fully stocked champagne bar. He wanted to arrive at the venue looking like he owned the entire city. My mother was not going to be outdone by her own daughter. She completely drained the last remaining funds from my father's retirement savings account to rent a diamond necklace and a matching set of chandelier earrings. She bought a custom silk dress and spent days visiting exclusive salons for aggressive beauty treatments. She bragged to every single person in her neighborhood, pointing to the rented limousine that picked them up and loudly declaring that her billionaire son-in-law was throwing a massive party in their honor. My father just followed along quietly, wearing an old suit he had desperately tried to have tailored to look modern. The evening of the Vanguard Holdings 10-year anniversary gala finally arrived. The event was hosted at the most prestigious grand ballroom in the entire city of Atlanta. The streets surrounding the venue were completely blocked off by private security teams and local police details. A massive red carpet stretched from the street curb all the way up the marble stairs of the grand entrance. The local media and hundreds of independent paparazzi lined the velvet ropes, aggressively flashing their cameras as the wealthiest and most powerful people in the country arrived. State governors, tech mogul, international real estate tycoons, and famous philanthropists stepped out of their armored vehicles and walked the carpet. Then the rented stretch limousine carrying my family pulled up to the curb. The chauffeur opened the door, and Monique stepped out first, posing dramatically as if she were a Hollywood celebrity arriving at a movie premiere. She was shivering in her rented gown, but she forced a massive artificial smile, waving at the paparazzi, who had absolutely no idea who she was. My mother stepped out next, adjusting her rented diamonds and lifting her chin with extreme arrogance. She practically shoved a local city councilman out of the way so she could stand directly in the center of the red carpet. Trevor stepped out last, buttoning his rented tuxedo jacket with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He looked at the flashing cameras in the towering glass venue, and he truly believed he had conquered the world. When a local business reporter approached him, asking for his name and affiliation, Trevor puffed out his chest and spoke directly into the microphone. He proudly declared himself to be the brother-in-law of the chief executive officer. He loudly boasted to the reporter that he was Julian's most trusted executive proxy and a vital strategic partner in Vanguard's recent commercial expansions. He essentially confessed to his own corporate fraud on live local television purely for the sake of his own monumental ego. I watched their entire arrival on a private security monitor from the executive green room high above the ballroom floor. Julian stood behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders, watching the screen with cold, calculated amusement. They were performing exactly as we knew they would. They were inflating their own fragile balloons right before we handed them the needle. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was dripping with unimaginable opulence. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over hundreds of perfectly dressed guests. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of vintage champagne and rare caviar. A live string quartet played elegant classical music from a raised balcony. It was a room filled with true generational wealth and absolute corporate power. My family walked into the ballroom acting like they owned the entire building. They completely ignored the designated seating charts and began aggressively mingling with the elite crowd. My mother found a group of wealthy socialites and immediately inserted herself into their conversation. She loudly bragged about her daughter's billionaire husband, twisting the truth to make it seem like she was the beloved matriarch who had orchestrated the entire marriage. The socialites exchanged polite, confused glances, clearly put off by her desperate, aggressive bragging. But my mother was entirely oblivious to their subtle disdain. Trevor headed straight for the premium open bar. He ordered the most expensive top-shelf whiskey available, tossing the bartender a generous tip from the money he had literally embezzled from the company. Drink in hand, Trevor began stalking the ballroom floor looking for high-profile corporate targets. He approached a group of senior Vanguard executives, men who actually ran international divisions and controlled billions in assets. Trevor boldly interrupted their conversation, introducing himself as the personal proxy of the chief executive officer. He began speaking in vague corporate buzzwords, trying to sound like a visionary leader. He hinted heavily that he was personally responsible for Vanguard's recent successful acquisitions. The senior executives simply stared at him, recognizing him immediately as a complete fraud, but remaining politely silent because he claimed to be family. Trevor interpreted their confused silence as profound professional respect. Monique was on a completely different mission. She grabbed a fresh glass of champagne and began aggressively searching the room for Julian. She wanted to be seen standing next to the billionaire host. She wanted the event photographers to capture her looking radiant beside the most powerful man in the room. She stalked through the crowd, her eyes darting everywhere, completely ignoring the actual business titans and wealthy philanthropists around her. She firmly believed that tonight was the night Julian would finally realize his mistake and elevate her to her rightful position. They were also completely consumed by their own massive delusions of grandeur that they did not notice the heavy security doors locking silently behind them. They did not notice the subtle shift in the room's energy as the Vanguard compliance officers took up strategic positions near the exits. They were entirely blinded by the glittering lights and the free-flowing champagne. Suddenly, the soft classical music from the string quartet faded into silence. A low resonant chime echoed through the massive ballroom, signaling the beginning of the formal executive presentation. The towering crystal chandeliers began to slowly dim, casting the room into a dramatic hushed shadow. A brilliant white spotlight illuminated the main stage at the front of the grand hall. Two massive high-define digital screens flickered to life on either side of the podium, displaying the sleek silver Vanguard Holdings corporate logo. The hundreds of elite guests stopped their conversations and turned their attention toward the front of the room. A wave of respectful silence washed over the crowd of billionaires and industry titans. Monique saw the lights dim and immediately went into a frantic panic. She grabbed my mother by the arm, her sharp acrylic nails digging deeply into my mother's rented silk sleeve. Monique began aggressively pushing her way through the dense crowd of wealthy guests, shoving aside prominent senators and corporate presidents without a single word of apology. She dragged my mother along, determined to reach the absolute front row center right beneath the illuminated stage. Trevor noticed their movement and quickly followed, pushing his way through the crowd with his whiskey glass still in hand, eager to secure his spot in the VIP Citadel. They reached the very front edge of the stage, standing completely isolated from the rest of the polite, respectful crowd. Monique leaned in close to my mother, her eyes wide and glittering with toxic manic excitement. Monique whispered loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear her unhinged plan. She told my mother that when Julian took the stage to deliver his welcoming remarks and acknowledge his beloved family, she was going to execute her ultimate move. She planned to walk right up the carpeted steps and step directly into the spotlight. She was going to take the microphone from Julian's hands and officially announce the launch of her luxury lifestyle brand to a captive audience of the wealthiest investors in the entire state. She truly believed the crowd would be mesmerized by her beauty, and that Julianne would be forced to publicly endorse her imaginary business venture. My mother nodded enthusiastically, adjusting her rented diamonds and patting Monique on the back, offering her full unconditional support for this deeply insane plan. Trevor stood beside them, taking a long, arrogant sip of his stolen whiskey, puffing his chest out, and preparing to nod graciously when the chief executive officer inevitably thanked him for his brilliant corporate proxy work. They were standing exactly where I wanted them. They were positioned directly in the brightest spotlight, standing front and center before hundreds of the most powerful people in the city, completely exposed and utterly defenseless. The trap was perfectly set, and the heavy steel jaws were about to slam shut. The massive ballroom descended into a state of reverent anticipation as the brilliant white spotlight tracked across the dark mahogany stage. The murmurs of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Atlanta faded into a thick, heavy silence. I sat in the shadows of the executive green room high above the floor, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the security monitors. Down below, my family was standing right at the edge of the stage, bathed in the spillover of the spotlight. They were buzzing with toxic excitement, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to open up and swallow them whole. Julian stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains and walked to the center of the stage. The moment he appeared, the entire ballroom erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. Hundreds of state senators, tech billionaires, and corporate titans rose to their feet to applaud the man they believed was the absolute sovereign of Vanguard Holdings. Julian moved with that effortless, terrifying grace, acknowledging the crowd with a slight nod of his head. He looked like a conqueror standing before his loyal subjects. Down in the front row, Trevor was clapping louder than anyone else. He had an arrogant, aggressive grin plastered across his sweating face, looking around at the elite crowd and puffing out his chest. He desperately wanted every single billionaire in that room to know that he was directly connected to the man on the stage. Beside him, my mother was waving frantically, trying to catch Julian's eye, acting as if she had personally orchestrated this entire corporate empire. Monique was practically vibrating with manic energy. She had positioned herself directly at the bottom of the stage stairs, her hands gripping the fabric of her rented crimson gown, physically preparing herself to march up those steps and hijack the microphone for her imaginary lifestyle brand. Julian stepped up to the acrylic podium and rested his large hands on the edges. The standing ovation slowly died down as the elite guests returned to their seats, hanging on his every anticipated word. Julian looked out over the sea of faces, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling directly on the three pathetic figures standing front and center. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Julian began, his deep, resonant voice, booming flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. Years ago, Vanguard Holdings was founded on a very simple but incredibly rigid set of principles. We believed that true wealth and lasting power could not be built on a foundation of deception. We built this empire on absolute transparency, ruthless accountability, and an unshakable commitment to corporate integrity. I watched on the monitor as Trevor nodded enthusiastically at Julian's words. The sheer magnitude of Trevor's delusion was actually staggering. He honestly believed that Julian was giving a motivational speech about conquering the weak. He had absolutely no idea that Julian was laying out the exact charges for his impending execution. In the corporate world, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. "We are constantly surrounded by parasites. We are surrounded by weak, greedy individuals who lack the vision to build anything of their own. These individuals attempt to attach themselves to successful enterprises, hoping to siphon off the hard work and dedication of superior minds. They believe that the rules do not apply to them. They believe that they can hide their incompetence and their corruption in the shadows. But at Vanguard Holdings, there are no shadows deep enough to hide a thief." A murmur of agreement rippled through the distinguished crowd. Business leaders nodded, recognizing the harsh reality of corporate espionage and embezzlement. Down in the front row, my mother smiled proudly, completely missing the lethal undertone of the speech. She leaned over and whispered something to Monique, pointing at the stage. Monique took a half step toward the stairs, her eyes shining with blind narcissistic greed. She thought this was the moment. She thought Julian was about to transition his speech to talk about the importance of visionary new partners like her. Julian paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the massive ballroom. The tension was palpable. He looked directly down at Trevor, holding the man's terrified gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. Unfortunately, Julian said, his voice, turning completely cold, corruption sometimes attempts to hide in plain sight. Sometimes the most pathetic forms of fraud attempt to shield themselves under the sacred banner of family. They foolishly believe that a personal connection will grant them immunity from the severe catastrophic consequences of their own actions. Trevor's arrogant smile finally faltered. The color began to drain from his face as the specific word fraud echoed loudly through the speakers. He shifted his weight nervously, suddenly hyper-aware of the intense lighting and the hundreds of people sitting silently behind him. But Vanguard Holdings does not protect parasites, Julian declared, his voice rising with absolute, undeniable authority. We expose them. Julian did not look at Monique. He did not invite my mother up to the stage. He did not thank his in-laws for their support. Instead, Julian simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The 2 massive high-definition jumbotrons flanking the stage flickered violently. My family looked up at the screens, fully expecting to see a heartwarming tribute video or a glowing introduction for Monique's non-existent business. What they saw instead sent a shockwave of pure horror through their bodies. The screens did not display a family montage. They displayed a massive, highly detailed forensic accounting file. At the very top of the 50-foot screens, Trevor's official corporate ID photo was plastered for the entire room to see. Beneath his smiling, arrogant face was a terrifyingly precise breakdown of his federal crimes. The screens flashed the exact date and time logs of his unauthorized system access. They displayed the dummy vendor accounts he had created, complete with the offshore routing numbers. Then the screens transitioned to show the ultimate piece of damning evidence. A side-by-side comparison of Julian's actual executive signature next to the clumsy, pathetic digital forgery Trevor had attached to the fraudulent loan documents. A loud collective gasp erupted from the hundreds of elite guests. The sound of a room full of billionaires reacting to blatant corporate theft was like a sudden vacuum, sucking the air out of the building. The attendees sitting in the front rows immediately recoiled from my family, physically leaning away from them as if they were carrying a highly contagious disease. In a matter of seconds, Trevor, Monique, and my mother were left standing completely isolated on an empty island of carpet directly in front of the stage. The massive screen shifted one final time, displaying the exact stolen amount in bright, glaring red text. $250,000 embezzled under the false claim of being the personal proxy of the chief executive officer. I watched my monitor as Trevor's entire world shattered into a million jagged pieces. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The heavy crystal glass of top-shelf whiskey he had been holding slipped through his numb, sweating fingers. It hit the polished floor with a loud, violent crash, sending shards of glass and expensive alcohol flying across the shoes of the nearby corporate executives. Trevor did not even look down at the mess. He was staring up at his own face on the massive screens, his mouth open in a silent scream of pure, undeniable terror. He was actively suffocating on his own public destruction. My mother staggered backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Her rented diamond necklace sparkled under the harsh spotlight, highlighting the absolute horror washing over her aging face. She looked around at the crowd of wealthy socialites and politicians she had been bragging to just 30 minutes earlier. Those same people were now pointing at her, whispering furiously behind their hands, their faces twisted in profound disgust. The flawless high society image she had spent decades cultivating was being incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the city. Monique was entirely paralyzed. Her grand illusion of stepping onto the stage and being embraced by the billionaire elite had vanished completely. The event photographers who had been waiting for the presentation to begin immediately turned their flashing cameras directly onto my family. Bright blinding flashes went off in rapid succession, capturing every single angle of their monumental humiliation. Monique desperately threw her hands up over her face, trying to hide from the ruthless lenses, trying to shield her rented designer gown from the reality of her husband's highly publicized felony crimes. Julian stood at the podium, looking down at them like a judge, delivering a fatal sentence. His voice boomed over the speakers, easily cutting through the panicked murmurs of the crowd and the sound of the camera flashes. Vanguard Holdings has zero tolerance for fraud. Julian announced his words, striking Trevor like physical blows. We do not negotiate with thieves. We do not cover up federal crimes to protect the fragile egos of mediocre men. Trevor Davis, You are terminated from your position effective immediately. You are no longer an employee of this company. And you are certainly no longer welcome in this room. Trevor completely broke. The reality of his situation, the sheer magnitude of his public execution, snapped whatever remained of his pathetic mind. He stumbled forward, slipping slightly on the spilled whiskey, desperately grabbing the edge of the stage. He looked up at Julian, tears of sheer panic streaming down his pale, sweating face. "You cannot do this to me," Trevor screamed, his voice cracking and echoing pathetically through the massive ballroom. "I am your family. I am your brother-in-law. You are married to Roxanne. We are blood. You have to protect me, Julian. You have to cover this up. If this gets out, I am going to prison. You cannot let them send your own family to federal prison." The absolute audacity of his plea made a wave of fresh, disgusted murmurs roll through the elite crowd. Trevor was standing in front of the most powerful business leaders in the state, openly begging a billionaire to commit a federal cover-up just to save him from his own greed. He was leveraging my name, leveraging the very concept of family that he and his wife had used to abuse and belittle me for decades. Up in the green room, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany desk, a dark, highly satisfied smile spreading across my face. I watched the monitor closely, waiting for the final devastating blow. Julian looked down at the weeping, hyperventilating man clinging to the edge of his stage. He did not show an ounce of pity. He leaned slowly into the microphone, a cold, predatory smile curving his lips, the kind of smile that promised absolute ruin. "I have no power to protect you, Trevor," Julian said, his smooth, calm voice echoing flawlessly through the silent, horrified ballroom. "I could not cover up your federal crimes, even if I wanted to, because despite what you and the media might believe, I do not actually own Vanguard Holdings." The entire grand ballroom descended into a silence so profound and absolute that it felt like the air itself had been completely sucked out of the room. Trevor remained frozen at the edge of the stage, his tear-stained face contorted in a mask of total unadulterated confusion. His frantic brain, which had been desperately clinging to the fragile illusion of family protection, simply could not process the words that had just left Julian's mouth. My mother stopped her frantic waving. Her rented diamond earring stopped swaying as her body went perfectly still. Monique stared up at the brightly lit stage, her mouth hanging open in a highly unattractive display of pure devastating shock. Julian stood calmly at the sleek acrylic podium, looking down at the broken, hyperventilating man weeping on the carpet. "Vanguard Holdings is a private entity," Julian explained, his voice carrying a smooth, steady cadence that commanded the absolute unwavering attention of every single person in the massive venue. "I am the chief executive officer. I manage the daily operations. I execute the complex corporate strategies. I am the very visible public face of this massive international empire. But I am ultimately an employee. I answer directly to the board of directors. And the board of directors answers exclusively to a single supreme entity." Julian paced slowly across the wide mahogany stage, the brilliant white spotlight tracking his deliberate movements. For 10 years, the financial world has heavily speculated about the true ownership of Vanguard Holdings. The global media has spent countless hours trying to uncover the hidden capital behind our incredibly aggressive corporate acquisitions. The truth is that this entire conglomerate is owned by an anonymous private trust. The visionary who founded this company built it entirely in the shadows, deliberately using my public corporate profile as a heavy shield to protect her absolute privacy. She did this because she intimately understood the deeply toxic parasitic nature of human greed. She knew with absolute certainty that if certain people discovered her monumental wealth, they would stop at nothing to bleed her entirely dry. Trevor was trembling violently now, his knees shaking so badly he could barely remain in an upright position. The horrifying realization was slowly, agonizingly clawing its way into his panicked, desperate mind. The elite crowd of billionaires and industry titans remained perfectly silent, hanging on every single word, captivated by the greatest corporate unmasking in modern history. Julian stopped pacing. He turned his attention back to my pathetic family, standing completely isolated and exposed on the ballroom floor. "You tried to leverage my marriage to save yourself from federal prison," Trevor, Julian said, his voice dripping with lethal freezing amusement. "You arrogant fool. You assumed that because I am married to Roxanne, I would somehow be forced by familial duty to protect her family. You thought you could exploit my wife to cover up your blatant embezzlement, but you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You see, the true mastermind behind Vanguard Holdings, the visionary architect who built this entire empire from absolutely nothing, the 85% majority shareholder and the absolute chairman of the board, is my wife. Julian raised his hand and gestured gracefully toward the grand sweeping marble staircase that descended from the executive green room high above the ballroom floor. The heavy velvet curtains parted instantly. A second brilliant golden spotlight swung across the dark, elegant ballroom, illuminating the very top of the marble steps. I stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding brilliant light. I did not look anything like the quiet spinster sister they had so viciously mocked at Christmas dinner. I did not look like the pathetic lonely failure my mother had continuously claimed I was. I looked like an absolute conquering queen stepping forward to claim her rightful throne. I wore a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green silk gown that cascaded flawlessly down my body, trailing dramatically behind me on the smooth marble steps. Heavy flawless diamonds rested against my collarbone, catching the intense spotlight and throwing brilliant scattering prisms of light across the massive walls of the ballroom. I walked slowly and deliberately down the grand staircase, my high heels clicking with a steady, terrifying rhythm that echoed like a ticking clock, marking the exact end of my family's sanity. The elite crowd of billionaires, politicians, and corporate executives went absolutely wild. A massive thunderous wave of applause and cheers erupted through the room, shaking the crystal chandeliers overhead. They were witnessing a legendary moment. The mysterious phantom chairman of Vanguard Holdings was finally stepping out of the shadows and into the public eye. Flashbulbs from the dozens of event photographers exploded in a blinding, frantic frenzy, capturing every single second of my triumphant descent. For 10 long years, I had played the role of a mid-level crisis management public relations director. It was the absolute perfect invisible cover for a woman secretly building an empire. My boutique public relations firm handled the dirty scandals of the ultra-wealthy, keeping me directly connected to the elite power structures of the city while perfectly masking my true staggering net worth. I took their frantic phone calls, managed their public relations crisis, and then quietly bought up their distressed commercial real estate assets through my anonymous holding trust. I built a multi-billion-dollar empire right under my family's unobservant, arrogant noses. I sat at their miserable, suffocating holiday dinners, absorbing their vicious, unprovoked insults, letting them call me a struggling failure while I was secretly the most powerful woman in the entire state of Georgia. I did it because I knew exactly who they were. I knew deep in my bones that my mother would have treated me as a living, breathing, automated teller machine. I knew my golden child, sister, Monique, would have aggressively demanded I fund her shallow, pathetic lifestyle choices. I knew Trevor would have tried to leverage my influence to climb the corporate ladder. He lacked the actual intelligence to climb on his own. Keeping my monumental wealth a deeply buried secret was not just a savvy business strategy. It was an absolute emotional survival mechanism. I reached the bottom of the elegant marble staircase and walked gracefully toward the center of the mahogany stage. Down on the ballroom floor just a few feet below me, my family was completely and utterly unraveling in real time. Trevor finally realized the true horrifying magnitude of his federal crimes. He had not just embezzled $250,000 from a faceless massive corporate entity. He had directly actively stolen money from the personal bank account of the very woman he had just publicly humiliated. He had stolen from the sister-in-law he had mockingly offered a minimum wage receptionist job to on Christmas Eve. He had insulted the sole owner of the company that he was actively robbing. The sheer overwhelming catastrophic reality of his fatal mistake finally broke his fragile, arrogant brain. Trevor collapsed entirely, dropping heavily to his knees on the carpeted floor, weeping openly and uncontrollably in front of the city's most elite citizens. He wrapped his arms around his own stomach, rocking back and forth in pure psychological agony. Monique looked like she had been struck directly by lightning. Her fake high society image completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified hollow shell. The older sister she had spent her entire life belittling, the woman she had confidently told everyone was a pathetic unwanted spinster, was standing right before her as a literal billionaire titan. Monique looked down at her rented crimson dress, the cheap, inappropriate dress she had foolishly hoped would seduce my husband, and realized she was nothing more than a pathetic broke imposter standing in a room owned entirely by the sister she despised. Her mouth opened in a silent screaming expression of pure devastating torment. The realization that I was the ultimate winner, that I possessed wealth and power she could not even begin to comprehend, shattered her narcissistic reality into dust. But my mother's reaction was the absolute pinnacle of the evening. Brenda stared up at me, her eyes wide with a profound, earth-shattering horror that bordered on actual madness. Her entire carefully constructed worldview, The twisted toxic family hierarchy she had meticulously built and violently maintained for 38 years, collapsed completely. The daughter she had actively hated, the child she had birthed as a bakery-level failure in front of our extended relatives, was actually the ultimate sovereign who commanded the very ground they were standing on. The sheer shock of this revelation was simply too massive for her physical body to process. My mother's knees buckled completely, giving out beneath her. She collapsed downward, her hands frantically grabbing the thick red velvet security ropes to keep herself from hitting the floor entirely. Her rented chandelier earrings swayed wildly as she stared up at the brightly lit stage, her face completely devoid of all healthy color. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps, looking at me as if I were a terrifying mythical creature that had just materialized to devour her soul. Her mind was frantically trying to reconcile the image of the daughter she abused with the image of the billionaire queen receiving a standing ovation from the most powerful people in the country. I walked smoothly up to the clear acrylic podium. Julian stepped back, smiling proudly with deep, unadulterated affection, as he yielded the center stage to his wife. I placed my hands gently on the smooth edges of the podium, looking out over the vast sea of cheering executives and wealthy socialites. I let them applaud for a few moments longer, absorbing the monumental validation of a decade of silent, relentless hard work. Then I slowly lowered my gaze, fixing my eyes directly on my trembling, hyperventilating mother. The massive ballroom began to quiet down, the elite guests instinctively sensing the deeply personal emotional execution that was about to take place. The silence returned heavy and pregnant with anticipation. The flashing cameras continued to go off, capturing the stark, dramatic contrast between the powerful woman on the stage and the broken, weeping family on the floor below. I reached out and calmly pulled the microphone closer to me, my emerald gown glowing brilliantly under the harsh white spotlight. I stared down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to break my spirit, and I prepared to deliver the final killing blow. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man who had tried to steal from my company and use my marriage as a human shield. Trevor was still rocking back and forth on the carpeted floor, completely destroyed by his own monumental arrogance. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing through the massive ballroom with absolute chilling clarity. "Trevor Davis," I said, my words slicing through the heavy silence like a sharpened blade. "You honestly believe that your proximity to my family would grant you immunity from federal prosecution. You thought you could commit blatant corporate fraud and hide behind the fragile illusion of suburban respectability. But Vanguard Holdings does not forgive thieves, and I certainly do not protect parasites who mock me in my own mother's dining room." I lifted my gaze from his sweating, terrified face, and looked toward the heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the grand ballroom. I gave a single subtle nod to the head of my private security detail. The massive doors swung open instantly. 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the brilliant light of the venue. They did not hesitate. They walked down the center aisle with absolute rigid purpose, their heavy boots thudding against the polished marble floor. The elite crowd of billionaires and state senators parted immediately, clearing a wide path for the officers as they marched directly toward the front of the stage. Trevor heard the heavy footsteps approaching. He turned his head slowly, his tear-stained face twisting into a mask of pure unadulterated horror as he saw the police officers advancing toward him. He tried to scramble backward, crawling on his hands and knees like a frightened animal, but he had absolutely nowhere left to run. The officers reached the edge of the velvet security ropes. They grabbed Trevor by the shoulders of his rented tuxedo, hauling him roughly to his feet. They slammed him against the edge of the stage, pulling his arms behind his back and snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the locking mechanism echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, sounding like the definitive end of his entire arrogant existence. Monique finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. As she watched the police officers physically restrain her husband, the brutal, devastating reality of her situation completely shattered her mind. Her fake high society image, her carefully curated social media life, her desperate delusion of becoming a billionaire lifestyle guru, all of it evaporated into thin air. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that ripped through the elegant venue. It was not a scream of sorrow for her husband. It was a scream of pure, monumental humiliation. She thrashed wildly, grabbing at the officers' uniforms, begging them to stop screaming that this was a massive misunderstanding, that they were wealthy, important people who did not belong in handcuffs. The local media and the event photographers descended upon them like a pack of starving wolves. Camera flashes exploded in a blinding continuous strobe light effect, capturing every single second of the spectacular downfall. They photographed Trevor weeping openly in handcuffs, his rented tuxedo wrinkled and stained with spilled whiskey. They photographed Monique screaming hysterically, her cheap crimson dress soaked in sticky champagne, her face contorted in absolute ugly desperation. The golden couple, the shining examples of success my mother had worshipped for decades, were being publicly permanently destroyed on the front page of every local news outlet in the city. I stepped back from the podium, watching the police officers physically drag Trevor across the ballroom floor toward the exit. Monique stumbled blindly after them, sobbing and screaming, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble as she chased her ruined husband out into the freezing Atlanta night. The formal presentation was officially over. The elite guests began to slowly disperse, murmuring in hushed, shocked tones about the incredible corporate execution they had just witnessed. They kept a massive, deliberate distance from my mother, treating the space around her like a highly toxic quarantine zone. Brenda was left completely alone, standing by the velvet ropes. Her favored son-in-law was on his way to a federal holding cell. Her golden child was chasing a police cruiser in a ruined dress. Her entire social standing was reduced to ashes. She looked up at the stage, her eyes finding me standing calmly beside Julian. The sheer desperate panic in her mind finally overrode her crippling embarrassment. She scrambled past the velvet security ropes, pushing frantically past a Vanguard security guard who gently tried to block her path. I gave the guard a brief signal, allowing her to pass. I wanted to hear exactly what she was going to say. I wanted to witness the absolute depths of her hypocrisy. My mother practically crawled up the carpeted steps of the stage. She collapsed directly at my feet, her hands frantically grabbing at the heavy silk fabric of my emerald green gown. She was crying real genuine tears for the very first time in my entire life. But she was not crying out of guilt or remorse for the decades of emotional abuse she had inflicted upon me. She was crying because her primary sources of narcissistic supply had just been brutally severed. "Roanne, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking pathetically as she stared up at me with mascara running down her aging face. "You have to stop this. You have to tell them to let him go. Please, you have so much money. You own everything. $250,000 is absolutely nothing to you. It is pocket change. You can just write a check and make all of this go away. We are your blood, Roxanne. We are your family. You cannot let your sister be destroyed like this. They are going to lose their house. Trevor is going to federal prison. Monique will be completely bankrupt. You have to save them. Please, I am begging you as your mother." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, trembling woman, gripping the hem of my expensive gown. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her. I did not feel any lingering sense of familial duty or daughterly obligation. The vast emotional void inside my chest remained completely frozen and undisturbed. I looked at her desperately pleading eyes, and I remembered every single cruel joke, every vicious comparison, every time she had proudly publicly labeled me a massive disappointment. I did not yell at her. I did not raise my voice or show any outward signs of anger. I simply looked at her with absolute freezing ice. I slowly reached down and gently, firmly peeled her shaking, manicured fingers off the fabric of my dress. I stepped back, creating a cold, deliberate physical distance between us. The camera flashes from the remaining photographers continued to pop, illuminating her pathetic kneeling posture. "You told everyone I was a 38-year-old failure, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, quiet register that only she and Julian could hear. "You stood in your living room on Christmas Eve, raised your glass of wine, and happily toasted to my complete misery. You told your friends I was a pathetic, isolated spinster who worked at a depressing job and had absolutely no future." My mother opened her mouth to argue, to spin another desperate lie about how she was only trying to motivate me, but the words died in her throat under the crushing weight of my cold, empty stare. "A failure cannot save anyone, Mom." I continued, throwing her exact toxic narrative directly back into her sobbing face. "A failure does not have the power or the resources to stop a federal indictment. A failure cannot pay off the massive debts of a fraudulent brother-in-law. A failure cannot rescue the golden child from the devastating consequences of her own shallow, pathetic life choices. Since I am nothing but a massive disappointment to this family, I suggest you let them be realistic about their choices, because nobody here is going to save them." My mother let out a loud, gut-wrenching wail of pure, profound defeat. She slumped forward onto the stage floor, burying her face in her hands, realizing with absolute horrifying clarity that she had completely permanently lost. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a comforting word. I simply turned my back on the weeping, broken woman who had tormented me for 38 years. Julian stepped forward, extending his arm to me with a look of deep, absolute adoration and respect. I looped my arm gracefully through his, lifting my chin and smiling radiantly. Together, we walked slowly away from the podium, leaving my mother sobbing on the floor in the ruins of her own unimaginable greed. The paparazzi cameras flashed in a wild, blinding frenzy, capturing the exact breathtaking moment. The billionaire queen walked away from the toxic wreckage of her past, never to look back again. Exactly 1 month passed since the Vanguard Holdings anniversary gala. The fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Trevor was formally indicted on multiple counts of federal corporate fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. Because he had foolishly attempted to forge the signature of a billionaire chief executive, the federal prosecutors did not offer him any lenient plea deals or quiet settlements. He was currently sitting in a cold federal holding facility awaiting a trial that would inevitably result in a lengthy mandatory prison sentence. The local news channels played footage of him being led into the courthouse wearing an orange jumpsuit, his arrogant swagger completely erased and replaced by the trembling reality of a broken man. The massive legal fees required just to secure a basic defense attorney completely drained whatever microscopic savings he and Monique had left hidden away. Without Trevor's corporate income, their entire fake affluent lifestyle evaporated overnight. The bank did not hesitate to initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling 5-bedroom suburban house. Monique returned home one afternoon to find federal agents and bank representatives seizing her leased luxury vehicles right out of her driveway. She was left standing on the manicured lawn watching the tow trucks drive away with her entire carefully curated identity. My parents suffered a social death that was far more painful to them than any financial ruin could ever be. The highly publicized arrest of their favored son-in-law became the absolute biggest scandal in Atlanta high society. The wealthy church members and elite socialites my mother had desperately tried to impress for decades completely cut ties with them. Brenda and Calvin were quietly but firmly asked to resign from their prestigious community boards, and their exclusive country club memberships were permanently revoked. When my mother went to the local upscale grocery store, women she had hosted for brunch would turn their carts and walk down different aisles, actively pretending she did not exist. The sheer crushing shame of the scandal forced my parents to rapidly sell their beautiful home at a significant loss just to cover their own mounting debts. They were forced to downsize, drastically, packing their belongings into a small rented moving truck, and relocating to a highly modest 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outer edges of the city. My mother no longer hosted elaborate holiday dinners or bragged about her golden child. She spent her days hiding behind closed blinds, completely terrified of running into anyone who knew about her monumental public humiliation. Monique was hit the hardest by the crushing weight of reality. Her useless college degree and total lack of actual work experience left her completely unemployable in the professional corporate sector. Stripped of her designer clothes, her luxury cars, and her wealthy husband, she had absolutely no choice but to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class. The former golden child, who had relentlessly mocked me for owning a bakery, was forced to accept a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing store just to afford her basic groceries. She spent 8 hours a day standing on her aching feet, folding cheap shirts, and serving the exact same working class people she had spent her entire life looking down upon. There were no more luxury wellness brands or seed investments in her future. She spent her lunch break sitting in a cramped break room, staring at her phone, realizing that she had completely destroyed her only connection to actual wealth out of pure malicious jealousy. I stood quietly on the expansive glass balcony of my downtown Atlanta penthouse suite, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me. The glittering city skyline stretched out endlessly before me, a massive sprawling empire that I quietly and firmly controlled. My smartphone vibrated softly on the small glass table beside me. The screen illuminated the dark balcony, displaying a blocked voicemail notification. It was my mother. She had been leaving desperate sobbing voicemails from various unblocked numbers for 4 weeks, begging for financial forgiveness, pleading for me to rescue them from the absolute wreckage of their own terrible choices. I picked up the phone and stared at the glowing screen. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or residual pain. I did not feel the crushing, desperate need for maternal approval that had haunted my entire childhood.